Altair Ibn Lahad drowns in ankle-deep water because Ubisoft never bothered building a swim button. Instead of admitting the gap, they wrote it into canon as an Animus malfunction, and that lie became the template every game after quietly leaned on. A bartender who never asked to inherit any of this would end up paying for that habit far more than a puddle ever could. The Animus glitch. Every single person who played the first Assassin's Creed remembers it. Altair steps into water that barely covers his boots, and he just dies, instantly. No animation, no struggle, just a grown man trained to leap off cathedrals drowning in what amounts to a puddle. The obvious explanation is that Ubisoft never built swimming into the game. That's true. But that's not the explanation they gave you. Instead, the Assassin's Creed 2 manual has Lucy Stillman step in and tell you it was never Altair's problem at all. It was the Animus. An early version of the machine, she explains, had an error that caused ancestors to drown the moment they touched water, a hardware flaw baked into the simulation itself. Not a design choice, not a missing feature, a malfunction inside the fiction, blamed on a fictional computer. And it worked so well the series kept using it. Every protagonist after Altair can swim just fine, and the games let you believe that's because the Animus got upgraded, not because the developers finally coded a swim animation. Ezio dives into Venetian canals, Connor swims through naval battles, Edward practically lives in the ocean. The technology improved, they told you, conveniently exactly in step with what the studio could actually build that year. Nobody demanded this explanation, nobody was owed one. A bug in a 2007 game didn't need a paragraph in a manual a year later assigning it a cause and a timeline. But Assassin's Creed did it anyway, and that instinct, patching a hole with mythology instead of just leaving it a hole, is the same instinct that runs under nearly everything strange this franchise has ever put on screen. It's a small thing, a man who can't swim in a puddle. But it's the first time the series looked at something it couldn't fix and decided the fix was the story instead. But the water didn't just take Altair's life over and over, it took something else from him permanently, and the only place you can watch it happen is a game almost nobody played. Altair Ibn Lahad swims through open water toward a burning ship, and canon has never fully recovered from it. Her name is Adha. She is the only love interest Altair gets in this particular corner of canon, and almost nobody has met her, because she exists entirely inside a 2008 Nintendo DS game called Altair's Chronicles. The final mission is literally called Always an End, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Altair races across a besieged coastline to reach a ship where Adha is being held hostage because someone finally gave the most controlled man in the Assassin Order something he could not control. That alone is quietly devastating. Desmond Miles lost his entire life to a bloodline he never chose. Altair, generations earlier, gets one shot at choosing something for himself, and the franchise buries it in a handheld spin-off most players never touched, sitting on a shelf between a Nintendo's cartridge and a scratched copy of Mario Kart. He does go on to marry Maria Thorpe and raise a family with her, so this was never his only shot at love. It was just the one nobody remembers, but the swim is the part that actually matters. To reach that ship, Altair escapes a burning wreck and swims to shore. Not teleports, not respawns, swims. Which means back in 2008, on a Nintendo DS, the series had already shown its own hero doing exactly that, years before anyone dreamed up an Animus glitch to explain why assassins can't touch water. Remember the fix from the last section, the one that quietly patched over a broken swimming animation with talk of corrupted genetic memory. That patch did not exist yet when Adha's story shipped. The excuse arrived later and walked straight into a contradiction that was already sitting on store shelves, waiting. It is the same machine every time. Something goes wrong, the writers reach for mythology instead of a fix, and the mythology gets left to rot the second nobody's watching. Adha isn't just a love story that got lost. She's proof the cover story was never airtight to begin with. Losing a love story is one thing, but before any of these people had a name worth remembering, the whole order nearly got stuck with one that sounds like a book club. Circle of Liberals. The most feared secret order in gaming carries a Latin name that sounds like a debate club at a community college, Liberalis Circulum. Translated, that is the Circle of Liberals, and it is not fanfiction or a scrapped pitch document. It is the actual in-canon name for a Roman-era branch of the Hidden Ones, founded in the 2nd century by a man named Lugos. Not a metaphor, not a nickname. Someone floated in a meeting and abandoned. A real chapter of the organization that would eventually become the most iconic secret society in video games, sitting quietly in the historical record of the franchise itself. The framing behind it was political, not mystical. Lugos built his branch around a stance, a position on how society should run, closer to a resistance movement than a hidden order of killers whispering nothing is true in the shadows. That name did not get erased, it got absorbed, one regional flavor of a much older tradition that eventually standardized under a cleaner, sharper, infinitely more marketable label, Assassins. One word, 0 committee meetings implied. This is not a plot twist buried in a database entry you skimmed past on a rooftop in Florence, but it is close. It is lore, confirmed and documented, sitting one layer beneath the games people actually played. And that raises a stranger question than a discarded working title ever could. If a branch of this order was explicitly political before it was mythic, then the mysticism people associate with Assassin's Creed was not necessarily the seed. Nothing in canon confirms this outright, but follow the pattern. The pieces of Eden, the first civilization, the ancient prophecy dressed up as history all get layered onto a brotherhood that at least once organized itself around a plain political identity rather than a cosmic one. The myth did not have to come first everywhere. Sometimes it arrived later and got stitched on. Desmond Miles spent his whole life trying to outrun an inheritance that, in at least one corner of its own history, started as a circulum with a charter instead of a prophecy. Rebranding a nobody into a legend is easy when the nobody is fictional. It gets a lot stranger when the same trick gets played on a man who actually conquered an empire. Father of Understanding. Julius Caesar has a job title that never once appears on a Roman coin, a Senate record, or a single surviving letter home. Historians have his campaigns mapped to the week, they have his assassination timed almost to the minute, and somewhere underneath all that documentation, Assassin's Creed decided the real Caesar needed a secret promotion nobody in actual history ever wrote down. The title is Father of Understanding. It sounds like something you'd find carved above a cult's front door, and honestly that's basically the job description. Inside the franchise, that phrase belongs to the ideological engine running behind the Templars, a rank for whoever's supposedly steering humanity toward obedient order dressed up as peace. It's not a helmet, it's not a sword, it's a title for the guy pulling strings, and in Assassin's Creed Origins, Lucius Septimius says it to Aya's face. Caesar is the father of understanding. That's not fans doing math in a forum post, that's dialogue. What's thinner is whether the title is Caesar's personally or just the label for whoever's steering that particular seat of Templar ideology at the time. Nothing in the games spells out a difference, but the pattern in the community is real. Some read it as Caesar's individual title. Others read it as a role that could pass to someone else entirely. That distinction never gets a straight answer on screen. Either way, once you notice the series doing this to Caesar, you can't unsee what it's actually doing. This isn't a boat getting a cooler name on a shipping manifest anymore. This is a documented human being, dead for over 2,000 years, getting quietly repainted with a secret resume he never applied for. The man conquered Gaul. He crossed the Rubicon knowing exactly what it meant. He didn't need a mystical rank stapled to his name after the fact, and neither did Desmond Miles, who got dragged into the same machine centuries later without ever once being asked if he wanted the job. The title isn't invented. What actually happened around it is worse, because when the knives came out for Caesar, the series makes sure you know there was already a woman standing in that room and she had zero intention of leaving quietly. Yay. Cleopatra did not kill herself with a snake. Assassin's Creed Origins looked at the most famous suicide in ancient history and decided it needed a rewrite. That is not a small liberty. That is the franchise walking into one of the most documented deaths in the ancient world and quietly swapping the ending. The official story has survived for over 2,000 years. Cleopatra, cornered by Roman forces after Mark Antony's defeat, chose death over capture and let an asp deliver it. Origins keeps the snake, keeps the tragedy, and slides a person into the frame who was never supposed to be there. Aya, a founding member of the Hidden Ones, is written into the moment as the one who helps arrange it, turning a queen's final act of defiance into something closer to an operation with a handler. And Aya is not some background figure invented to pad out a side quest. She is one of the two central protagonists of the entire game, standing next to Bayek at the birth of the organization that becomes the Assassin Brotherhood. Her fingerprints are on Caesar too. Origins ties her directly to the killing of Julius Caesar, one of the most analyzed assassinations in human history, and folds it into the founding mythology of the Hidden Ones. As if the real conspirators needed a co-writer, the Senate got the credit. Brutus got the headline. Origins wants you to know there was a hand behind the hand. Nothing in the historical record supports an assassin operative present at either death, but follow the pattern the series has been building. A title stitched onto Caesar's story was one thing. An entire operative inserted into the moment he died is the series no longer decorating history. It is overwriting the parts historians already closed the book on. Desmond never got a say in whose story he was born into either, and neither did Caesar, apparently 3 separate times over. Fans still argue about where the history stops and the game begins here, and that argument is the point. Origins is not filling a gap. It is claiming the gap was never really closed. Rewriting who killed a man is bold. Rewriting who made the man in the first place and what he was built for from the very start is the reveal this whole series has been circling since day one. Project Anthropos. You were built to work. Not you specifically, obviously, but every single human being who has ever lived according to the actual lore of this actual franchise. That is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration for effect. Assassin's Creed's entire mythology rests on the idea that humanity did not evolve so much as get manufactured, engineered by a species called the Isu to serve as a labor force. Cheap, obedient, replaceable labor, built for the job, not the other way around. And that program has a name. Project Anthropos. Say it out loud. Chances are you never have, even if you've finished every game in the series, platinumed every trophy, and read the codex entries most people skip entirely. That is the strange part of all this. This is not some throwaway detail buried in a footnote about crop yields or trade routes. This is the single biggest reveal the franchise has ever made. The actual foundation underneath a decade and a half of hidden blades and hooded assassins and rooftop chases, and it is filed under a name most players couldn't pick out of a lineup if you gave them 3 guesses. The Isu ran the planet long before recorded history even started keeping score. They were technologically advanced, long-lived, and in desperate need of a workforce that wouldn't ask questions or unionize, so they built one. Humanity, in this mythology, exists because a smarter species needed hands that didn't belong to them. We were staff, subordinate, disposable, and engineered for obedience long before we were ever engineered for anything resembling free will, not partners, not successors, equipment. The label itself is a deep cut, thin enough that some fans still argue about exactly where it originated and whether it's even the official term. Nothing in canon carves that name into a monument somewhere, but follow the pattern anyway because you don't need the label to feel the weight of what it's naming. Every war between humans and Isu that follows, every uprising, every myth twisted into scripture across 10,000 years of human history traces back to one relationship: creator and created, owner and property. That's the war Desmond Miles was born into and never asked for. The one that eventually spent him down to nothing, just to keep the lights on for a species that saw people as a tool first and a civilization a distant second. And that's the part worth sitting with. If you were built as labor, nothing you're proud of was ever the point. To whatever built you, your best ideas aren't achievements. They're just the machine doing what it does, running exactly as intended, clocking in on schedule, and somewhere in that machine, something once looked at the whole of humanity's story and filed it as a problem to be corrected. Juno. To an Isu, the smartest thing an assassin has ever said is a symptom. That is what nothing is true. Everything is permitted actually is once you flip the glass around. Humans treat it as philosophy. Juno treats it as paperwork. Somewhere in the specs for a labor species built to obey without question, a line got crossed out, and the thing that grew in its place learned to doubt orders, doubt gods, doubt its own leash. From the workshop's side of the machine, that is not enlightenment. That is a defect report with a body attached. Juno's contempt for humanity is not a mood. It is consistent, load-bearing, and stated plainly across the material she appears in. She doesn't see people as a fallen civilization mourning its makers. She sees an unruly appliance that never finished cooling. Every human idea gets read through that lens, including the one they are proudest of, the one they built entire orders and centuries of war around, and the pattern is not subtle. Juno's disdain shows up again and again, always the same shape. Humans as tools, humans as leftovers, humans as a workforce that developed opinions it was never issued. Say it enough times and it stops sounding like an insult and starts sounding like an inventory count. Run that logic all the way through, and The Assassin Creed stops looking like wisdom completely. Certainty is a trap, the assassins say, so stay loose, stay doubtful, stay free. To Juno, that is just a labor unit refusing to hold a fixed setting. The workforce did not just get exploited, it got graded, and it failed the test its makers actually cared about, staying obedient, not staying alive, not staying free, just staying quiet and doing what it was told. That is worse than the mining, worse than the draining. Being built to be spent is one kind of horror. Being told by the thing that built you that even your best idea reads as a manufacturing defect, that is a colder kind of insult. One species got harvested for parts. The other one got a peer review from something that never respected the species enough to argue back, because you do not argue with a toaster that starts asking questions. You just note the malfunction and move on. Think about what that means for a guy who never wanted any of this. Somebody who just wanted a normal life, forced into a bloodline war, drained out like fuel to save people he never met. And the beings who built the whole system in the first place would have looked at him and seen a unit behaving exactly as designed. Unpredictable, doubting, human. Not a hero, not a martyr, a glitch that happened to be useful on its way out, filed under acceptable losses and forgotten. It is easy to be cold about a species when you are the one holding the clipboard. Distance does that, paperwork does that. It is a different kind of cold when the clipboard gets put down, when the ones running the same errand today stop grading humanity from a distance and start doing something a lot more direct to the people who wander too close to what they are protecting. Harry Houdini. The greatest escape artist who ever lived finally hit the one trap he couldn't get out of, and Assassin's Creed decided that was no accident. Houdini built an entire career on proving that nothing supernatural was going on. Every levitation, every vanishing act, every sealed box he crawled out of had a mundane trick behind it. He spent his last years actively hunting down psychics and mediums and exposing them as frauds on stage. This is the man the series chose to drag into its secret war over reality-warping alien tech. In the official record, Houdini died in October 1926 from complications after a ruptured appendix. Assassin's Creed side lore isn't interested in that ending. Instead, it slots his death into the same pattern the franchise uses on nearly every famous corpse in history, the idea that nothing significant ever just happens, that someone with a piece of Eden and a grudge was standing just off camera. In this version, the Templars are the ones holding the knife, chasing him down over an artifact he supposedly got too close to. Nothing in canon lays out hard proof for this one. It's a single reframed death, not a documented conspiracy with names and dates attached, so treat it as the thinnest kind of series lore, but follow the pattern the show already trained you on, and the leap basically writes itself. It's also just funny. The man who dedicated his life to telling people there is a rational explanation, I promise, gets rewritten by writers who insist there wasn't one. Not for him. Somewhere Desmond Miles, drained and burned out saving a species that never voted him in, would probably recognize the joke. The machine doesn't care who you are. It grades gods in the abstract, and it reaches into the real world to correct a magician who got too curious. Killing a showman over a shiny relic is one thing, but the series didn't stop at men who chased magic. It went after the one man who tried to build a mind out of pure math, and it decided that mind had to die too. Alan Turing. The most disturbing murder in Assassin's Creed lore doesn't happen to a fictional character. It happens to a real man, and the franchise treats his death like a plot hole it can quietly fix. Alan Turing broke Enigma, helped end a world war, and laid the groundwork for every computer you own. In 1954, he died from cyanide poisoning, officially ruled a suicide after the British government chemically castrated him for being gay and stripped him of his security clearance. It's one of the genuine tragedies of the 20th century, the kind the same government eventually apologized for decades later. And somewhere in the conspiracy layer of this franchise's lore, someone decided that wasn't the real story. The claim floating around the series' modern-day mythology is that Turing wasn't destroyed by a country that couldn't stand who he was. He was murdered by Templars, terrified of what his machines could become. Nothing in canon dramatizes this. There's no cutscene, no memory sequence, no document with Abstergo letterhead confirming a hit. This is a single motive grafted onto a real death, and it deserves to be named as exactly that thin. But follow the pattern anyway, because the franchise has already shown you how it thinks. A magician who claimed to escape death gets treated as a threat worth erasing. A mathematician who built the theoretical blueprint for every thinking machine on Earth gets the same treatment, except this time there's no trick involved at all. That's the actual escalation. Houdini was punished for what he claimed to control. Turing gets punished for what he actually built, before the Templars even know what it'll become. This isn't cleanup anymore. It's premature demolition, a secret order snuffing out a future it hasn't even seen yet. The same instinct that later drains a bartender in a basement rather than let his bloodline finish what it started. Fans mostly treat this one as the franchise's most audacious real-world graft, taking an actual national disgrace and slapping a hooded order on top of it like it improves the story. It doesn't. It just proves the machine will reach for any grief lying around and call it lore. Fearing what one mind might build is paranoia. But the series goes further. It claims the most famous image in the history of biology wasn't a discovery at all, but a leak from something that was here long before us. Rosalind Franklin. Photo 51 is one of the most important images in human history, and fans have quietly decided it might not be a human discovery at all. That is the whole premise. The picture that cracked the shape of life itself gets treated as something we did not find so much as something we were shown. Photo 51 is the X-ray diffraction image Franklin captured in 1952, the one that revealed DNA's double helix structure and handed the modern world the blueprint for genetics. Real image. Real breakthrough, zero fictional origin, at least officially. But Assassin's Creed has spent over a decade insisting humanity's greatest leaps are not leaps at all, they are recoveries. The franchise's entire mythology rests on the idea that the Isu built human beings as a workforce, then vanished, leaving behind fragments of impossibly advanced knowledge scattered through history for us to stumble into and call genius. Nothing in canon ever confirms Franklin's photograph was one of those fragments. But follow the pattern the series has repeated with piece after piece of human achievement, and the theory practically writes itself. If Isu technology has bled into human history before, quietly, without anyone noticing the source, then a photograph that exposed the literal architecture of life is exactly the kind of discovery the franchise would love to reclaim. Da Vinci's designs got the same treatment, so did entire scientific movements. Franklin's image just happens to be the most intimate one, because it is not a machine or a weapon, it is us. It is the code running underneath every person alive. That is where it stops being a fun theory and starts being unsettling. Desmond Miles spent his final months believing his blood made him special, a chosen thread in a chain he never asked to join. If the very shape of that blood, the DNA itself, was something the Isu left behind for humans to rediscover, then Desmond was never just carrying ancient memories. He was built from ancient homework. Even fans who love this stuff mostly shrug at it. There is no mission, no data log, no dying scientist whispering the truth. It is speculation stacked on a motif, nothing more. But the franchise does not stop at flattering fiction and old inventors. It has, at least once, pointed directly at a real government program that actually happened, and asked you to believe the same invisible hands were involved. Project Bluebird. This one isn't a lie, that's the problem. Project Bluebird was a real CIA program greenlit in 1950, built to test how far you could push the human mind before it broke and did exactly what you wanted. Hypnosis, drugs, sensory deprivation, interrogation techniques designed to strip a person down to something that just follows orders. The declassified files are real, the budget lines are real. The subjects, most of whom never consented to anything, were real people who walked in and came out different, if they came out at all. Assassin's Creed didn't invent a mind control program for this one. It just found one already sitting in a filing cabinet and added a single word, Templars. Nothing in canon confirms the order actually ran Bluebird, but follow the pattern the franchise has been building all video. The Assassin's Creed universe treats intelligence agencies the same way it treats everything else, as fronts, as puppets, as organizations that think they're steering history while somebody older steers them instead. The CIA becomes another Abstergo. The scientists become another set of Vidics, chasing results they don't understand for a client they've never met and never will. Once you accept that logic, a real behavioral control program stops looking like fiction and starts looking like a job application the story was always going to accept, and that's what makes it worse than Franklin's photo. That one required the series to reach into a real event and quietly overwrite what actually happened there. Bluebird requires nothing. The history is already this dark on its own, no editing needed. Somewhere in the middle of it is a person who agreed to a study and ended up a case file, no different in outcome from a man who wanted to run a bar and got mined for a bloodline instead. The franchise didn't have to build the horror this time, it just had to point at a wall and whisper that the wall was always theirs to begin with. That should feel like a relief. It's the opposite. When the fiction stops needing to invent and starts just annotating real history instead, you lose the one thing keeping you safe from it, the certainty that somebody, somewhere, made this up. A mind control program is a small secret room, but the series takes the same logic and aims it at something enormous, public, and looking straight up, an entire agency it claims was never really about science at all: NASA. The moon race was never really about beating the Soviets. In this reading, it was about who got there first, for reasons that had nothing to do with flags, and definitely nothing to do with patriotism. Every institution in this franchise turns out to be wearing a costume, and by this point, you should expect nothing less than the biggest costume imaginable. NASA is real, founded in 1958, funded by Congress, built to put Americans on the moon before anyone else managed it. That part is not up for debate. Nobody is disputing the rockets, the budget, or the flag. What is up for debate, and this is a leap with basically nothing dramatized to back it up, is the idea that a secret order got there first, structurally speaking, and simply let the government run the program on its behalf like a landlord letting a tenant think they own the place. Follow the pattern anyway, because it is at least consistent. If a hidden room under a bar can be repurposed, and if a person can be pruned and rerouted without ever knowing it happened, then an entire federal agency is just a bigger room with better funding. Same logic, same appetite, scaled up until it swallows the sky whole. The wiring underneath a bluebird's cage and the wiring underneath a rocket gantry start to look less like two different stories and more like the same handwriting on two different pages. Here's the part that makes it almost funny. The series never dramatizes this claim in any meaningful way. There's no mission, no memory sequence, no artifact that says the Templars filed the paperwork for Apollo. Zero. It exists because fans noticed the shape of the franchise's obsession, hidden orders behind public institutions, and pointed that obsession at the one building on Earth where it was guaranteed to feel enormous. And it works, in a grim way, because everything this franchise touches eventually gets repossessed. Desmond didn't get to keep his own life once the bloodline caught up with him. Why would humanity get to keep its own moon landing? Owning the agency is one thing. It stays abstract. A building, a budget, a flag pinned to a hallway map somewhere in Houston? It gets a lot less abstract, and a lot stranger. The moment the story stops talking about who ran the building and starts talking about who they put in the capsule. Buzz Aldrin. 3 men leave Earth on July 16, 1969, and by the logic this franchise runs on, all 3 are working for the Templars. Not the agency, not some faceless division with a badge and a mission statement, the actual astronauts. Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins, the most photographed, most interviewed, most celebrated humans of the entire century, get quietly filed as a covert cell in the fan logic this series invites. Nothing in canon says this outright, but follow the pattern the last section just set up. If NASA was a front, the front needs employees, and employees need faces, so the theory just picks the 3 most famous faces on the planet and hands them the job. Think about what that actually requires. Zero secrecy. The entire species watched the launch live. Hundreds of millions of people stared at the screen on July 20th and saw exactly what happened, exactly who did it in real time, with zero editing. And the claim is that this specific moment is the one the Shadow Society chose to run its operation through. That is not hiding in the dark. That is standing under 600 million floodlights and calling it cover, which is weirdly the whole trick, working better than it should. Nobody suspects the man everyone can see. Aldrin does interviews for 50 years, Collins writes a memoir, Armstrong becomes the most quoted man in American history. And the theory just shrugs and says, sure, that is exactly what the disguise looks like when it works. It is the same machine from the last entry, just wearing a spacesuit now instead of a lab coat. Desmond Miles got buried under lore he never asked for until his own body ran out of use. These 3 get buried under lore too, and history has already had its say on 2 of them. Armstrong died in 2012. Collins died in 2021. Only Aldrin is still around to never be asked if he minds. The evidence is basically nothing. 3 names, 1 launch date, and a framework hungry enough to swallow anyone standing in front of a camera long enough. It is the thinnest reach in the entire ecosystem, and it is still somehow the most fun one to say out loud. If the men on the rocket were pieces on a board, someone had to be moving them back home. And the series claims the seat that matters most, the one behind the desk everyone salutes, was filled the same careful way. Lyndon B. Johnson. On November 22, 1963, the President of the United States was assassinated in broad daylight, and within hours the entire chain of command had already moved to the next man. That is not a conspiracy detail. That is documented, verified, constitutional fact. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One that same afternoon, and the transfer of power happened exactly the way the law says it should. So naturally, the franchise looks at the cleanest succession in modern American history and asks what if it wasn't. Nothing in canon says Johnson was installed by anyone, and the games never dramatize it, but follow the pattern the series has built for 13 sections straight, and the shape is unmistakable. Assassin's Creed has spent decades teaching you that every institution you trust is a costume worn by something older. Governments do not just happen to change hands, they get handed. A president does not simply die. He gets replaced by someone the Order already had waiting in the wings, briefcase packed, oath memorized. That is the entire trick of this kind of lore. It does not need a gunman on a grassy knoll or a secret memo with a wax seal. It just needs to whisper that the most scrutinized, most investigated, most picked apart moment in 20th century American politics was actually the plan working perfectly. The tragedy becomes the cover story. The lawful thing becomes the coup, precisely because nobody thinks to question the paperwork. Remember Houdini, reduced from headline act to a single line item that some other magician got pruned out of history for daring to compete with. Now scale that same instinct up from one man's career to the presidency of the United States. The machine that quietly rewrites who gets remembered does not stop at magicians and moon landings. It reaches for the desk in the Oval Office too, because if a franchise is going to claim that hidden hands steer the world, eventually it has to put those hands on the biggest chair in it, and that is the part worth sitting with. Somewhere underneath all of this, a franchise that once cared about one tired, unwilling man carrying a bloodline he never chose has drifted so far into rewriting real history that the difference between a bartender who got mined for genetic memory and a president who got mourned by a nation starts to blur into the same conspiracy engine. By now it feels like one shadow runs everything, so it is genuinely strange that the series keeps a second group on the board. One, it insists, has absolutely nothing to do with the Order that has apparently been rewriting every headline you just watched. The Illuminati. Assassin's Creed had one job: keep the conspiracy simple. Assassins on one side, Templars on the other, ancient robots pulling the strings underneath. Instead, the series looked at that setup, decided it wasn't cluttered enough, and reached straight into real-world conspiracy folklore to grab the most famous secret society on Earth. Then it refused to let that society answer to the Templars at all. That is the part that should stop you. The Illuminati shows up in this universe as its own thing, floating around the same shadow history as Abstergo and the Brotherhood without actually reporting to either one. Think about what that means for a franchise that spent 14 sections convincing you one bloodline, one order, one buried machine explained everything from Houdini's escape acts to a stolen presidency. Turns out the hidden hand had roommates. Unnamed, unexplained, never folded into the main org chart, just sitting there because the name was too good to leave on the table. That is not world building. World building connects things. This is a franchise hoarding real-world mythology like trading cards, grabbing anything with cultural weight, and stuffing it into the lore closet without checking if it fits. The Templars already covered secret group secretly runs history. Adding the Illuminati next to them, unconnected, isn't depth. It's the writers admitting they saw a famous name and could not stand to let another studio use it first. Fans have spent years trying to sort which of these groups are load-bearing canon and which are just seasoning sprinkled on top for flavor. Nobody agrees, because the evidence is thin on purpose. A name drop here, an implication there, never dramatized enough to settle it. The honest answer is the series never picked. It just kept the drawer open. And that is the real pattern, underneath 14 sections of tidy conspiracy. It was never one machine with one plan. It was a machine that kept absorbing other machines and never explained what half of them were for. A series that collects secret societies like trading cards still has to explain what it does with the people it uses up. And there's one it never let go of, not even after it burned him down to nothing. Desmond Miles. Desmond Miles spent his whole life running from his family, and the machine that finally caught him didn't stop working once his heart did. That's the part people skip. He dies at the end of Assassin's Creed III, willingly, arm shoved into a device to stop a solar flare from cooking the planet. Roll credits, cue the tragic music, except Abstergo doesn't do closure. Abstergo is the Templars in a nice suit and a research budget, and a body like Desmond's doesn't get buried. It gets filed. Think about what he actually was to them, not a person, a bloodline with legs. Every scrap of genetic memory the series has mined since, every Animus session, every corporate archive built on ancestral DNA, traces back to the same well he came from. He was the source code. And source code doesn't get cremated when the program's still running. That's the pattern the post-Desmond era quietly confirms. Story after story keeps circling back to his genetics, his relatives, his line, like the franchise physically cannot let the family tree stop producing content. A company that harvests memory for profit does not politely dispose of the one corpse proven to contain the best memories on the planet. It processes it, tags it, keeps it cold and useful. He wanted out so badly he changed his name and poured drinks for strangers just to feel like nobody's descendant. Turns out you can't opt out of being valuable. You can only die and become easier to handle. And that's the quiet horror underneath all the body horror this franchise loves to flirt with. The pruned scientists, the fronted agency, the puppet in the president's chair, all of it was the machine reaching outward, grabbing what it needed from the world around it. This is the machine reaching directly into the one man who begged to be left alone and confirming that even in death, he was still worth something to somebody with a lab coat. He didn't get to object. That was the whole design. Once a bloodline is worth mining, nobody who carries one is safe from the reaching, and the franchise has a habit of following that thread all the way back, past every descendant, past every heist, until it snags on a woman the game's claim was standing there before any of this started. Evie. Evie Frye is the most competent person in the entire Assassin's Creed franchise, and somehow the internet decided that wasn't enough for her. She outthinks her twin brother in almost every mission, cracks a citywide conspiracy with a magnet and a piece of string, and hunts a first civilization artifact through Victorian London without ever needing a glowing bloodline to justify it. And yet there's a corner of the fandom convinced she's secretly descended from the first woman who ever lived. Not metaphorically, literally. The franchise trained everyone to think this way, so it's worth remembering how. Isu blood shows up in Assassins and Templars alike, stretching back through Desmond, through Adam and Eve themselves, through characters whose entire personalities eventually get reduced to whatever ancient DNA they're carrying. Evie never gets that treatment. Nothing in Syndicate ties her lineage to anything older than her own father. The theory exists because fans took a pattern the series built everywhere else and pointed it at a character who never asked for it. Nothing in canon says Evie descends from humanity's first woman, but follow the logic fans are chasing anyway. The series loves hiding meaning in blood, so if you squint at any sharp, skilled protagonist long enough, someone online will eventually ask what ancient thing might be inside her. That's not evidence, that's a reflex. And that reflex is the uncomfortable part. Desmond got mined for his blood by a corporation that only saw him as a vessel for something older and more valuable than himself. Now picture fans doing the same thing to a fictional woman, quietly deciding her competence alone can't be the whole story, that there has to be a bigger destiny buried in her chromosomes somewhere. Evie Frye planned heists, ran a criminal empire, and beat her brother to nearly every major discovery in the game, and none of that was treated as enough to make her matter on its own. Rewriting a character's ancestry because the audience wants more myth than the writers gave them is one kind of habit. The stranger version shows up when the people writing the games sit down with something that actually happened, something already sitting in the historical record, and choose to write around it instead. Scalping. You can drown a redcoat in Boston Harbor, stuff his body in a hay cart, and walk away whistling. You can rack up a body count in the hundreds across the frontier, and the game will hand you a synchronization bonus for it. But there is one specific documented practice of the American Revolution that Assassin's Creed 3 would not let you touch. Scalping was on the table. The developers considered it, looked at everything else they were letting players do, and cut it anyway. The stated reason was simple. It was too graphic for the experience they were building. Not too violent in general, since the game is already soaked in violence. Too graphic in this one specific, historically real way. That is the strange part. This is a franchise that built its entire identity on stabbing men through the throat in broad daylight, in front of crowds, in front of children, in some cutscenes. Zero hesitation there. But frontier scalping, a real practice with real historical documentation behind it, got quietly removed and never spoken of again. Every other piece of useless lore in this video exists because the series had a hole and papered over it with mythology. Altair's water bottle got a legendary excuse. Evie Frye's timeline got stretched to cover a continuity gap. This is the opposite move entirely. Nobody invented anything here, they just took a real ugly piece of history and made the hole on purpose. Fans still argue about it. Some say cutting it made the game feel sanitized, like the developers flinched at the one moment history actually got as brutal as the marketing promised. Others say it saved Assassin's Creed 3 from crossing into something exploitative that no amount of historical accuracy could justify. Both sides are circling the same uncomfortable fact. A franchise that sells itself on unflinching historical truth flinched. Once, on purpose, and never explained the line they'd drawn beyond a single sentence about graphic content. Think about what that means for a series built entirely on the promise of showing you what really happened. Someone, somewhere, decided which real historical truth was safe enough for you to see, and which one had to disappear. Desmond Miles never got that kind of mercy. Every ugly truth about his bloodline got dragged into the light whether he wanted it or not. History apparently gets to keep some secrets. People don't. Deciding what history to erase is one kind of power, but the same studio, on a different game, once sent one person to stare at a single real building until they could rebuild it stone by stone, and nobody could explain why it mattered so much until years later. Notre Dame. Somewhere in Ubisoft's Montreal offices, one person spent 2 straight years staring at a single building, not a franchise, not a timeline, one cathedral, stone by stone, until they could rebuild it from memory. That building was Notre Dame de Paris, and what came out of those 2 years is still considered one of the most accurate architectural reconstructions ever put in a video game. This wasn't a quick reference pass or a handful of photos taped above a monitor. It was years of study into buttresses, vaulting, statuary placement, and interior geometry, all so that Assassin's Creed Unity could put players inside a version of the cathedral that matched the real one down to details most visitors would never consciously notice. Think about what that actually means. Every other entry on this list exists because the series cut a corner, hit a mistake, or papered over something broken with a myth. This is the opposite. Somebody looked at an 850-year-old building and decided the honest thing to do was refuse to fake it, refuse to guess, refuse to shortcut. Historians and architects have pointed to Unity's Notre Dame as a genuine reference quality model, the kind of digital preservation that outlived its own purpose in ways nobody could have predicted. And that's the detail that turns this from trivia into something heavier. When fire tore through the real cathedral in 2019, that obsessive 2-year act of devotion suddenly mattered in a way nobody building it could have known it would. The pattern behind this one is thinner than most, but it lines up too cleanly to ignore. This game, the one built around that single act of sincerity, is also the game the entire fanbase remembers as a technical disaster. Faceless citizens, physics glitches, a launch so broken it became a meme before it became a memory. Somewhere inside that wreckage sat the most careful, most honest work the series had ever produced, and almost nobody was talking about the cathedral. They were talking about the bugs. That's not a coincidence so much as a mirror. The same studio capable of burying a body under a legend, the same machine that spent Desmond down to nothing and called it destiny, was also capable of spending 2 years getting one thing exactly right. The reverence and the carelessness weren't opposites fighting for control. They were coming from the same place at the same time in the same building, 2 years of devotion filed under a joke, which raises the question this whole thing has been circling. What does this series actually do when it has to choose between the name that sounds legendary and the truth that doesn't? The Jackdaw. A jackdaw is a small black bird that steals shiny objects and hoards them where nobody can find them. That is not a metaphor somebody forced onto this section. That is the literal bird. And Ubisoft named its most beloved pirate ship after it, on purpose, after almost calling it something else entirely. Early development on Assassin's Creed 4, Black Flag had Edward Kenway's ship carrying a different name, El Dorado. The same El Dorado that has haunted this franchise since the first game, the Golden City, the treasure that every conquistador and cartographer chased and never found. It is the most mythic word in the entire series' vocabulary. Gold. Legend. A city that justifies dying to reach it. They cut it. They gave the ship a scavenger's name instead. And it worked, because Edward Kenway was never the Golden City. He was a Welsh privateer with more ambition than money, stealing a Templar's identity to climb a ladder he had no right to climb. A ship called El Dorado tells you what the story is chasing. A ship called the Jackdaw tells you what the story actually is. A thief, dressed sharp, hoarding things that don't belong to him. Fans latched onto that immediately. Nobody asked for the treasure map name back. Nobody ever has. That's the one time this franchise looked at its own mythology and chose the smaller, truer word over the gilded one. And once you see it, you can't unsee where the rest of the paint went. The Animus glitch that got canonized into a smoke monster instead of admitted as a bug. A century of buried devotion nobody dramatized because it was cheaper to leave it a footnote. Deaths overwritten, agencies fronted, a body pruned and mined and drained until there was nothing left to drain. Every single one of those is an El Dorado, a shiny name stretched over something the series didn't want you looking at directly. Desmond Miles never got a Jackdaw. He got the Gold City treatment his whole life. Savior, chosen bloodline, last hope, right up until he was spent like a battery, and the credits rolled over what was left of him. Nobody renamed that one. Nobody let it be small and true and personal. It stayed legendary, because legendary is easier to sell than a man who just wanted to run a bar and never got to. The Jackdaw wasn't renamed to sound better. It was renamed because for one brief moment, this franchise understood that the mythic name is always the lie, and the scrappy real one is the story worth telling. It just forgot that lesson everywhere else, for 15 years, one gilded patch at a time. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.